Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to day two of our Intro to Trout Fishing Friday evening webinar series. I am Dan Dowd, and I will again be your host and moderator tonight. And on behalf of Trout Unlimited and Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, I want to thank you for being here with us today. So we hope you're able to join us last Friday for our talk on trout fishing gear with Kelly Williams and Emma Brown. If not, that's okay, but be sure to look out for the replay link in our follow-up emails. As a quick recap, though, for last week, we covered all the gear that a new angler or beginning angler may need to kind of get started fishing for trout. That includes your fishing license, conventional spin fishing gear, fly fishing gear, accessories that you might need, and even a little bit about knots. For today's presentation, we're going to take it to the next step for you and hopefully teach you how to find and then catch some trout. Before we begin, I just want to make sure I remind you to mark your calendar for next week, Friday the 28th. That'll be our third and final day of this series. That day is special, as I said last week, and if some of you don't know, this event is mainly focused in Pennsylvania and Colorado. So for next Friday's presentation, we will actually be sending out two separate links because next Friday is finding fish in your state. So Colorado area will get a Colorado Zoom link, and Pennsylvania will get a Pennsylvania Zoom link. And in there, we're going to have some great presenters that are going to get really kind of narrowed down into your area and give you some good information about types of water that are close to home for you, and then some hot spots to hopefully kind of get you jump started and get you out there catching some trout. We'll dig a little bit after that into some conservation issues that your specific state is focusing on and dealing with, and what kind of TU, BHA, and then either Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission or Colorado Parks and Wildlife are doing to help out our friends the trout. Another housekeeping item, just be sure if you have any questions to type them out in the chat so we can keep log of them, and hopefully at the end of our presentation today, we'll have a really good Q&A session like we had last week. We've got some great participation, and for those of you that were with us that participated, we appreciate it, and keep those questions coming. So let's kind of jump into the presentation today. What can we look forward to? So we're going to dig a little bit first into the biology of trout. We'll get into reading water and understanding what reading water on still waters versus reading water and moving water kind of looks like. We'll talk about some presentation techniques to get either your fly fishing gear or your conventional fishing gear and tackle into the water and entice a fish to bite. And then we'll talk about handling best practices for what you do once you do eventually catch a trout. And then we'll wrap it up again with a Q&A panel and try to answer as many of your questions as we can. So now I'd like to introduce our all-star cast that we have today that's going to be presenting for you. So first we have Mr. Eeland Stribling. Eeland is a wildlife educator and biologist. He's a stand-up comedian and a fly fishing instructor out in Colorado. Next we have Garrison and Corrine Doctor. The doctors are co-founders of Rep Your Water and self-proclaimed fly fishing geeks. And then finally, we have Sascha Clark Danylchuk, executive director of Keep Fish Wet, and she's also a fisheries scientist. So right now, we're going to dig into, like I said, the biology of trout, and I will let Eeland take it away.
Hello, everyone. Hope your Friday is going well. We're just going to get into the real basic and sort of the biology and identification of trout here that we have. So first off, if you all can, I can't point at anything, so I'm just going to point on my screen, but in the United States, we have 4 different species of trout. They're not all part of the trout family, but we call them trout anyway. So we have the brown trout, which is, if you're looking at your screen, into the top left, the one that's sort of furthest out of the water. You can usually tell a brown trout by the white circles filled in with the darker colored spots. Sometimes they can look red, sometimes they can look like a light brown, sometimes they don't have as many spots, but you can always tell the brown trout, and sometimes they have like a sort of a blast a splash of blue on their operculum, or kind of their cheek, on their gill plate, and that's another good indicator. Some people say you can identify brown trout by their white fins, but if we move on over to the brook trout, oh yeah, there are more species of trout, sorry. If we move on over to the next one, the brook trout is not so much a trout as it is a char, but a really, really popular species all over the country, especially on the East Coast and some of our alpine and higher, colder waters here in Colorado. And you can tell the brook trout because they have, once again, those circles on their back, but their circles are filled with a yellowish, dark bluish sort of colors, and they have white circles. And if you can look at their fins are really, really orange with sort of a white stripe on the very end of them. Younger ones, look really, really light. And I've learned that the older they get, the darker their shading gets. But they always kind of have that like cool different halo color on the back with a bunch of different colors. And then we'll move down from the brook trout to the cutthroat trout, Colorado's only native fish that we have here. And the cutthroat trout, it can be hard to discern between the rainbow and the brown sometimes, or between the cutthroat and the brown and the cutthroat and the rainbow sometimes, just because of the different color variations. But one of the main things that you can look at are underneath the gill plates. So where that guy's thumb is, underneath those gill plates, if they're feeding, if you hold them and you see a flash underneath their gills and it's red, it looks like they're bleeding. That's why they're called the cutthroat trout. I know in Colorado we have 4 different species of cutthroat, and they all look, very, very different. And then across the country, there's so many more species. So that's a cutthroat trout, and then probably one of the most popular trouts is the rainbow trout. It disappeared, but the rainbow trout is, you can tell because it has a pink operculum. It kind of gets this pink near its jaw, as well as has usually like a standard pink line down its body. Sometimes it's red, sometimes it's pink. And it just looks like it's a bunch of different colors. When you see them all in person, it's kind of easier to tell from these photos. But those are the 4 main species of fish that people sought after in Colorado. All right, so the anatomy of a trout. So if you look at a trout compared to something like a bass, it's much more cylindrical, much more torpedo shaped. And that's because they're not so much prey animals. They're not so much stalking animals. Trout usually are always on the move or moving around. And so they're kind of have this torpedo shaped. And when they're swimming in fast water, they can open their caudal fins, which is this very, very back fin here. They can open their caudal fins and kind of get a big push to get out of the way or chase some food downs. But usually when they're just kind of hanging out in the current or swimming, that caudal fin is a little bit shorter, a little bit flatter, as well as super fanned out. And they're just moving and cruising. And if we can look at some of the fins here, starting from the front to the back. So from the front, we of course have the eyes, the nostrils at the very, very front. And then we have the operculum. The operculum is sort of that flap that covers the gills that you may see open. You may see some people, if you're keeping fish, they'll put the stringer through their gills. So that's the operculum there right in front of the pectoral fin. And the pectoral fin is the one that kind of helps them stay balanced, is the one like their little arms. That's their pectoral fins. Their dorsal fins are the ones that's on their back. If you've ever seen a shark or seen the movie Jaws, that's the dorsal fin that's sticking out of the water. Trout have that too, as with most fish. The pelvic fin is directly below the dorsal fin though. So the pelvic fin is just right underneath the belly. That helps them when they're spawning, and that helps them with stability in the water. And then moving back from the pelvic fin is the anal fin. That's right in front of or it's right behind their anal hole. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but it's right behind the where they reproduce babies, where they desecrate. And then the adipose fin. The adipose fin is, I know a lot of people, use it to decide wild trout, wild steelhead and stuff like that. But the adipose fin is sort of that little thumb-like appendage right before the caudal fin. Some people say that helps with understanding current and sort of understanding pressure and things like that and be able to control. But that I don't believe that's 100% true. And then the caudal fin is that is the big rudder, is the big tail. So that's the design and the shape of trout. What's next? Gills. So we have our gills here. So if you can look at this, can anyone guess what sort of fish this is? You can just yell it out, say it out loud. Correct. It's a rainbow trout. You can see this sort of pink shiny part. That's its operculum, and its operculum is covering its gills. So some people call it the gill plate. Some people call it the operculum. But that's a rainbow trout, and that sort of pink circled part is covering its gills. Fish need water. They still need oxygen, but they just need dissolved oxygen in the water. And so water needs to pass through their mouths, out of their gills for them to get oxygen. So it covers, so as water's flowing through their mouth, so that's why sometimes when you see fish are being revived or people are trying to let fish go, they'll kind of be pushing the fish forward. Because if a fish is just sitting there, it's not getting as much oxygen as if water is going through its mouth, out of its gills. So that's its. Those are the gills. In front of the gills, you can see the eyes, so the field of vision. I've seen trout where sometimes their eyes, it looks like they're looking at you, then sometimes it looks like they don't want to be bothered. But those are trout eyes. They do have a good range of vision. It's sort of all the way forward as well as all the way around them, as you can see in this picture, and as well as not just forward on a planier level, but they also can look straight up. One of trout's predators are eagles and osprey, and those and us, and so they have to be able to look above them to see if there's anything that's going to attack them or eat them or anything like that. So they have a very wide range of view, as well as right above them, they have great eyesight. And then smell. Trout do have a pretty good sense of smell. I know growing up when my grandfather would take us out and we used worms, just like regular spin fishing, he would always dip them in power bait because he just said it was his extra luck charm. I didn't believe it worked, but he always caught more fish than me. So trout do have a really good sense of smell. Now the lateral line, I think this is really, really cool, and most if not all fish have this. So the lateral line, I don't know if you all can see it on this brookie, but there's some of those circles look like they're like half filled in, they're like kind of cut off. So the lateral line is a distinguished line that goes from their head to their tail, and it's sort of like a sixth sense. So it's like if when Spider-Man, when someone is about to attack Spider-Man and it's like little spider senses go off, that's the same thing it is for trout. So it's like this thing to feel pressure, to feel energy, to feel water current. And so a lot of fish have it, no matter what species. If they're in the ocean, sharks have it. It's just like this extra ability to feel when the school is moving, to feel when something hits the water, jumps in the water. Sometimes we don't think like our flies or our lures, the fish can sense it, but they can sense it when it hits the water. They can feel us when we walk onto the bank. There may be some sort of shift in the water or the area, and they can feel that. It might not always spook them. Sometimes it may, but that's their lateral line. It just runs directly on the middle of their body. And then you can see a little bit, this brook trout sort of has this little glossy coat to it. That's their protective slime. That's it's like this clear coating that protects the body from fungus and bacteria and different diseases. And so another important part of trout is they are very, 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 very soft. They're not as hardy as some other species. So that slime actually protects them from a bunch of different bacteria and diseases. So we try to keep them wet. If we're going to return them to the water, we try to keep them as wet as possible to not damage them any further. All right, trout need basic needs of trout. They really need only 3 specific things: food, what we all need; oxygen, what we all need; and shelter. They don't need cheeseburgers, but they will eat a bunch of other stuff that's trash. So different foods that trout normally eat. I mean, this can vary on location, on seasons, on water temperature, on water flow, but basic insect, aquatic insects like mayflies, caddis, stonefly, midges. Midges usually are around most of the year. Stoneflies are usually on natural natural rivers during the spring and the summer and the fall. Caddis are usually always around, and mayflies you can have a good mayfly hutch during the spring and during the fall. So those are aquatic insects that fish. Not only do they eat on the surface, if you ever seen a fish coming up to the surface and eating something, but most of their diet is below the surface. So eating nymphs, eating other creatures like crayfish and scuds or bugs and worms, all that's below the surface. Sometimes fish will eat other fish eggs during spawning season. You know, fish will post up in a stream, and if this fish is spawning, then this fish is eating all the eggs that it's kicking up or it's releasing. They'll also eat grasshoppers, beetles, ants, pretty much anything that lands on the water that they can fit in their mouth as a good meal. They will eat. Something else that they eat, which is what my desire is to catch, is sometimes they eat mice. So if you get fish big enough in a stream, in a river, in a creek, sometimes in a lake, but if you get a fish big enough and it's hungry enough and it's aggressive enough, it'll eat live mice, and you can sometimes find fish with mice in their belly. All right, the second need is oxygen. So this is a cicada year on the East Coast. So it's going to be, I wish I was there to fish, because I mean, all those cicadas, all those trout are going to be so hungry and full. It should be good dry fly fishing. So fish need oxygen as well, as we all do. And the colder the water, the more oxygen it has. So the colder the water, the more oxygen it has. So especially for trout, trout like really cold. They like cold water in order to breathe and move around. And so there's this little, what's this thing called? Not temperature scale. Oh, thermometer. There's a little thermometer here. And it kind of shows you when the optimal time, and this can always change based on where your location is, but this is the optimal temperature that fish will be most active. So, you know, below 65 degrees, and we might not think that's, you know, super cold, but to a fish, that's pretty cold. And then 65 to 66, 7 degrees is kind of warmer. And then everything above, you know, 68, you know, close to 70, that's warm water for trout. So it's going to have less oxygen. They're going to be less active and not as eating as much. Now, there's other species that thrive sort of in that 68 or warmer water, but trout don't do so well with that cold water, just because it doesn't have enough oxygen for them as they're moving around. And last but not least, shelter. So shelter can look like a bunch of different stuff. And for most species, freshwater species, shelter is important as they go from their juvenile stages, the par stage, all the way to their adult stage. Just because what I talked about, them having predators, whether that's birds or other animals, vertebrates, or mammals or us or whatever that may look like. So they need shelter. Now that shelter can be, you know, deep, slower water where it's harder to see, so they can be safe down there. There's large rocks that fish can hide behind or hide around. Logs or trees. I know, you know, bass love being around logs and trees and then cut banks. And so that's something that a trout will think the same thing of, its safety. There may be food available. And if fish have all three of those things, shelter, food, and oxygen, then that's a happy fish. So if you can find a fish that has, you know, shelter and food, or good oxygen and food, then you could, you know, a little bit easier to catch. Overhanging grass, undercut banks, and weeds. So if we look at some shelter examples, so if you right where this kind of water line is on this riffles, deep water, and rock ledge, on this sort of rock ledge here, you can see the bubbles of the current. So that kind of whitish water, that's going to be the fastest, that's going to have the most oxygen, but also that's pretty vulnerable and a dangerous place for a smaller trout to be, any fish to be. And so if you look kind of closer to the mountain, to the hill, you'll see it's a little bit darker. It kind of even looks like there's some grass maybe covering that side. that's going to be, you know, if you spook a fish in the white fast water, that fish is going to spook until the deeper water so it can hide and get away. Here we have where it says deep water, rock ledge, and submerged boulders. You can see the water coming kind of from the bottom left and going to the right. And you see all the rocks underneath the water and kind of this cut bank here. I wish you guys could see my mouse. Cut bank here to the left. Fish would, if you spooked them, if they were in danger, yep, perfect. That's where exactly where it would be. Fish would kind of hide into those shadows. Fish would go deep behind those rocks, next to those rocks. It's pretty impressive how invisible fish can be when they decide to be spooked or not be seen. This is what we were talking about. So as you can see in this far left picture, you can see actually the down logs in the lake, sort of in the reflection of the lake, and then around the lake. Yep, this is so that's a safe place for a fish to be. You know, if it sees a bird, if it sees you walking up, it's gonna dive beneath, you know, go beneath the rocks. If it gets hooked, if you hook into a fish, sometimes the first thing they're do, they're gonna try to go to shelter. They're gonna go into deeper water. They're gonna go into where the logs are. They're just gonna try to get away from whatever is happening so they can feel safe. And then overhanging grass and kind of cut banks. This is the fun sort of fishing during the summer and fall here and spring during Colorado, because you get these creeks, you get these rivers, and then you get these places where it doesn't look like there's any fish, but fish need shelter, food, and oxygen. And shelter, food, and oxygen are going to be right up against the banks, where if something falls into the water, they can easily grab it. If they get spooked, they can just literally tuck underneath the grass and kind of just hold water there. And it's not going to be as hot. It's going to be a lot cooler in the shade. Kind of on the other side of this bank where we can see these shadows, that's where fish are going to be holding.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eeland. Really appreciate that. So we're gonna move into some reading water and presenting your bait, lure, fly to the trout, and hopefully we'll be getting a fish to eat. So I'm going to let Garrison and Corrine Doctor take it away.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming tonight. Eeland really set the stage for us here on the reading the water when we're thinking about all those trout needs. So they like to not work very hard. So they like to stay by their shelter, stay where the food's easy, and stay where they can breathe really well. So that's kind of the general idea that we're going to be using when we're thinking about looking at water and thinking, where should we be casting to be able to put some food or fake food in front of a fish to catch it. Overall, a lot of the same principles apply. The animal itself is the same. It still wants oxygen, still wants food, still wants shelter. So no matter whether you're on a small creek like we see in this picture, or a much larger river, or we'll also be talking about Stillwater with lakes and stuff like that, the same concepts apply. And so we are really looking for, Eeland actually already pointed out a lot of places where fish would be. So we're kind of looking at those general spots to be able to present a fly, present a lure, present a piece of bait to these fish to be able to catch them, which is what we're all here for to talk about.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm going to jump in here and just kind of point out a few spots in a little more detail so you can see the yellow oval there. That soft water is a common term. You can see it's kind of glossed out. It's between two faster pieces of current, right? It's moving a little bit slower. That gives it that softer feel, not as disturbed on the top. That disturbance is showing that faster current, right? So that's a nice spot for fish to be hanging out, and they have access to that fast current to feed, right? So they have nice food coming through on that current that they can snag. Current seams in general are really nice spots if you can present your fly, lure, or bait in those seams. They provide just a happy place for a trout to hang out, right? For all those principles we've been talking about. They don't have to work too hard, and they can just hang right in there and snag whatever they want that's coming down. And you can see just barely, which is kind of typical in a trout stream that has a little bit of color to it like this, but you can see those submerged rocks. Those are great places, as Eeland touched on, for trout to hang out. Also keep in mind that there's obviously a pocket behind the rock for a fish to hang out. The rock also makes a current sort of bulge or pocket in front of the rock where a fish can kind of surf the current, if you will, but can kind of hang there without expending too much effort. So in front and behind of a rock can be a nice place for a fish to hang out. So moving on to Stillwater, to lakes and reservoirs, really when you approach a lake or a reservoir fishing for trout, you want to find something you can key in on, right? Some piece of structure, some piece of current, something that's going to kind of give you a little bit of a mental confidence, like, hey, I think there's going to be a fish that could be here. This is a nice spot, right? So it depends on the elevation when you're talking about trout, exactly where those fish are going to be, depending on the time of year. But some things to look for would always be, a stream inlet or outlet, right? Where we have that current flow. That current is going to deliver a lot of food to the fish, right? So you can see it in this little illustration, right? Which
That'd be spot 1 and 2.
Spot 1 and 2. And this is probably condensed down, right? Usually you would roll up to a lake that's probably larger than this. And this kind of illustrates to us some of the great spots. Outflow, as with the inflow, right? You're still delivering food to the fish that they can target. Shore and shallows, another thing to keep in mind there, which is number 8, is weed beds. That's pretty common in especially lower elevation, higher nutrient trout lakes. You'll have weed beds form. Those are great edges to work through. If the water temps are cool enough for fish to be really shallow, like the water temperature on the surface is still nice and cold, they will come in and cruise for anything they can grab off the surface, really shallow. And if they do have a little bit of overhead cover, Eeland mentioned aerial predators for trout is something that they deal with and they want to avoid, right? So if you can have a spot where they can hang out under a bush, under a tree, any of that type of thing is nice cover for them. And then submerged structure, Eeland, showed us that great photo of submerged rocks or logs, excuse me. But if you have like a rise or any type of rock structure that's coming up, a little weed bed, maybe it's a point that juts out into the lake that creates a little bit of structure. Maybe it's a transition zone between 2 different substrates in the lake. In other words, it's going from like really big rocks to more of like a grassy bank. And if that kind of translates down in the water, sometimes those transition zones can be something to look for a little bit.
Or even visually, you can sometimes see like it starts shallow and then it cuts into a really deep spot. Right at that cut, it sort of acts the same way that a rock would. It kind of gives that trout more confidence to be right off of that shallow ledge, and you can target them right there.
And in lakes or rivers, sometimes if you can't really see the bottom, you can still see a color change in the water. So you might not be able to really see like, hey, I can tell this water is going from 2 feet to 6 feet, but you'll be able to see like, hey, this water is going from light blue to dark blue pretty quick right along this line. Whatever that depth change is, that's probably a good transition zone to hang a fly for a little bit, or your bait or lure. So, this slide is just kind of to illustrate reading the water sometimes is the hardest thing, right? Presenting your fly or lure to the fish. You don't need to overthink it too much. It's a skill that we always, any of us passionate anglers, work on throughout our lives, and something you can get better at, but you don't need to be an incredible caster to be a very successful fisherman.
Yeah, step one is always thinking, where's the fish going to be? And now we get to think about how we're going to show them the food.
Right.
Obviously, with fly fishing or fishing with lures or spinners, you're using fake food. And with bait, you're presenting a real food opportunity. But now that we know where they're going to be, we're thinking about how we are showing them this food opportunity. So the number one tip for this is to take a breath, take a pause before you go charging up and start trying to read that water. So you just got out of your car, you've got everything ready, the stream's right over there, the lake's right over there. Just take a breath, look ahead, and go slowly. This has a lot to do with the two of the pieces that Eeland mentioned. So that field of vision situation that trout see so much better than we often give them credit for. And then also that lateral line. So if you just stomp up on a really nice, soft, grassy bank, chances are that water goes really far underneath it and the fish can feel that vibration. And they're either going to tuck down thinking danger, or they're totally gone and out of there. So number one is go slow, start from farther away than you think, and take a breath. And then we're using all of those reading the water techniques that we talked about. So you're looking for the places that the food's going to be coming down, because that's where the fish are going to be waiting. And then you're going to give them the food that you're offering. And all of those same principles apply. And like Garrison just said, you do not have to be an expert caster to catch fish. You have to think about all the things that you know really well, and really tap into those pieces. So if you're really feeling confident about, I know that right behind this rock, there's going to be a fish, that's where you're going to focus your energy. And it's okay that you can't cast a country mile.
Yeah. And it's something, you know, I've been fishing for an embarrassing amount of years at this point in my life. And it's something that I still remind myself of as much as I can, is if I'm especially approaching a piece of water that I'm unfamiliar with, is just to move slowly and to observe as much as possible. Because if you move slowly and observe, you might see a fish that's feeding in some shallow water in front of you. I'm not a particularly patient person. So my impulse is like, I want to get after it. I want to charge in the water and I want to get going and I want to catch a fish. But sometimes just being patient can really help. Yeah, and that's sort of our first bullet point here is like, stop, think about where fish might be, and also just open your senses to everything you can take in on that river or lake. Maybe there's some bugs that you're seeing that are hatching. If you're fly fishing, that can be a really valuable piece, right? Hopefully you can maybe see a fish feeding, like I said. And as Corrine touched on, you don't want to spook fish. Sometimes fish will hold in very shallow water. And if you charge right in to cast to the deep spots, they're gone.
I always like to just fish the spot where I'm about to step. So I fish it, just a couple casts. Like if there was a fish there, I want to catch it. And then I will step there and fish into, like, you know, the quote unquote meat of the water.
Let's see. So some presentation techniques for moving water. We're going to start with the fly fishing pieces here. It's what we do most of the time. It's what we speak to most knowledgeably. And just kind of broad brush strokes. Obviously, we talked about like where we think these fish are going to be hanging out. Usually what you're trying to do is present your fly in such a way that it feels like an insect that's drifting naturally and helplessly in the current, right? If you're using any type of fly that's imitating an insect, you know, insects do swim and have some ability to like move in the water, but for the most part in a trout stream, they're pretty helpless. So if you can present that fly in a way where it just is as natural as possible, is usually a good bet. And that goes for if you're fishing a fly on the surface of the water, a dry fly, or if you're fishing a fly underneath the surface, a wet fly or a nymph. if you do see fish rising, obviously that's a great time to try a dry fly. And it's a very satisfying experience to like see a particular fish that's feeding, be able to sort of pattern it a little bit. Hopefully you can see what type of insect that fish is feeding on, come up with at least a decent approximation in terms of a fly. Usually it doesn't have to be perfect. And if you can cast out and catch that fish that you saw, it's a really fun experience. If you don't see any fish rising, sometimes you can throw a dry fly on the surface and just
into a suspect spot.
Yeah, and a
You know
fish
it's
that
gonna
you
be there.
didn't see rising will come up and eat it. So you don't necessarily need to see fish rising to be successful fishing a dry fly. But if you don't see any fish rising, it's a good opportunity to fish a wet fly or nymph. And as Eeland mentioned earlier on, the majority of trout's diet, they eat on subsurface. That's the majority of their food that they consume is in nymphs, insects, anything that's fallen into the water and is down in the water column a little bit. When you're casting your fly, you want to be as close as you can to those really good looking places where we talked about fish hanging out a little bit, and managing your line as much as possible to facilitate a nice natural drift with those flies, and also managing your line in such a way, if you're fly fishing where if a fish does eat, you can come tight to that fish as quickly as possible, because fish have pretty good senses. Usually when they eat a fly, they can tell very quickly that this is not an insect. And so
You fooled them visually.
correct. But a lot of times if they eat a fly and you didn't necessarily see them eat a fly, or you have a lot of slack line on the water, they can eat that fly and spit that fly out, even though there's a hook on the fly, and it's gone and you never would even know. So those are some things to work on down the line a little bit if you are taking up fly fishing for trout, is line management on the water and that natural drift piece. But usually casting upstream or up and across and letting your flies drift back to you is the easiest way to put your flies in front of a fish naturally, and also to present your flies to a fish that hasn't seen you if it's facing upstream.
And just, we have this nice diagram here. So, you know, a nymph is going to be under the water. And then on the top of the water is going to be what in fly fishing we call an indicator, because it indicates whether a fish ate under the water or not, but it really is just a bobber. And what you will see is when that fish eats the nymph, or sometimes if you catch a rock under the water, that bobber will go down. And sometimes it's just really minor. Sometimes it shoots down. And that is the moment that the fish eats, and you want to set that hook. And hopefully then you have the fish on the end of your line. It certainly doesn't always work out, but that is the difference here. Dry flies, Garrison was mentioning, the fish comes up and eats the fly, and you see that. That's your visual cue for knowing that the fish ate. But with this nymphing rig, as we have in this diagram, it's the bobber or the indicator at the top that you see go down into the water.
And this type of indicator nymphing rig is a really nice place to start, because you can see the indicator quite easily on the water. Sometimes, especially a smaller dry fly, it's hard to keep track of visually on the water with all the current seams and glare, and it's hard to see where it is. So the indicator is very easy to see, and you're presenting that fly subsurface. I used to say back in my guiding days, if that indicator looks at you the wrong way, set the hook. If it hesitates, you feel like you get some weird juju from it, just check, always check.
Hook sets are free.
Those hook sets are free, because those trout can be, as I said, very quick, and you have to realize there's quite a bit of slack between your indicator and your nymph. And there's some time built in there where a fish could eat and spit your fly if you're not right on them.
We're passionate about that part.
So we did also want to touch on streamers and bait fish patterns for fly fishing, and these principles will cross over very closely to fishing spinners or lures as well. both methods, you're imitating some type of bait fish, right? Maybe it's a small trout, maybe it's a dace, maybe it's a sculpin, some other type of small fish in the river or lake. And so basically you're emulating the movement of that prey fish, hopefully putting it near a trout. In moving water, it's sort of opposite of fishing a dry fly, where you would want to be casting up and across. It's easiest to present a streamer down and across at, some sort of 45-degree angle. And then without having to strip much line in, the current is going to move that fly across actually surprisingly quickly, and kind of move it through a lot of different zones in the river and give a lot of fish hopefully an opportunity to come take a look.
To think that there is a scared bait fish that they just need to come check out.
Right. So in terms of conventional fishing, we talked about natural presentation of dry flies or nymphs. The same theory would apply if you're presenting bait to a fish. It's worth noting that, check the regulations where you're trout fishing, right? A lot of places here in Colorado, you can fish with artificial flies and lures only in certain places. Bait fishing is allowed in certain places. So obviously make sure in your specific body of water that if bait fishing is your preferred technique, that's a legal technique.
And a lot of places don't allow live bait because sometimes those can be invasive species. And if it gets off the hook, then you're contributing to a different problem.
Right.
So always check your regulations on what is allowed in the type of fishing. And then of course, also when Sascha takes over, whether you're only catching and releasing or keeping fish.
Right. But fishing a bobber with bait underneath it is going to be very similar to that indicator rig that we talked about earlier, right? You want that to drift naturally with the bait underneath. It's easier to control that bobber with a spinning rod or a conventional rod, because the line doesn't have any weight, so the line's not usually laying on the water and creating drag that way, as you will manage with fly fishing. If you are, obviously we're just touching on here, but you're targeting those same places, right? So this looks like a really nice spot where you can see this bobber in the photo. You have kind of right on the edge of a fast current. You have structure with that log.
And the color change.
And you got a little bit of a color change. So there could be a fish that could eat just sitting right on kind of our side of that color change, or maybe a fish that's sitting more towards that log side is going to come out and take a swing. And then, as I mentioned, talking about streamers for fly fishing, spinners and lures are a similar principle in terms of covering water. With spinners, lures, and streamers, one thing to really consider is speed and depth, right? Are you presenting that moving fly or lure at a depth where the fish are feeding and can have a chance to take a look at it? And are you presenting it at a good speed? And you can just try different ones, right? That's always the best move, is be a little bit targeted, a little bit analytical, and say, okay, I'm going to fish fast for a little bit, see if I see anything. Okay, I'm going to slow it way down, see if I get anything. I'm going to try deep. Oh, I'm going to try some shallow, right? Switch it up, see if you can get a pattern going, and you'll find some fish. So here's a simple illustration of a bobber rig, not dissimilar from our indicator rig. You'll have to use some weight, or you'll have to put your bait on a jig maybe, right? Depending on how you want to get down. For trout fishing, if you're fishing in a moving piece of water, really anywhere you're trout fishing, I would try to go pretty minimalist on your bobber size and your rig in general. Try to go a little bit smaller, just to make less impact when you cast, visual, spook less fish, all of those things.
Oh, Stillwater, here we are. So the same exact principles apply to Stillwater as they do with a river with when you're first showing up. So lakes and ponds, just like a river, that vibration of your footsteps will go out. So you really want to take some time. And lakes, if it's a calm day with no wind, those fish can see for a very, very long distance and very easily. And fish are kind of moving around on their own because, Eeland mentioned that in a river, it's easier for fish to get water through their mouth into their gills to breathe. But in a lake, the fish are artificially doing that for themselves. They are moving in order to breathe. So the fish are moving around a lot in lakes. Sometimes you're thinking, oh, well, there's no fish right here right now, but honestly, they probably will show up soon. And lakes in Colorado. So obviously in Colorado, we have like really high altitude lakes. That's a great spot for beetles, like Eeland mentioned, if we're thinking about a dry fly. And that can be great whether or not you see them eating on the surface, because beetles are not hatching constantly, they just blow in. And so that's sort of an opportunistic eating situation. But in, kind of your average lake, you do want to kind of be looking at the water, taking that time. If you see fish, little ripples coming up and eating off of the surface, that's a great opportunity for fly fishing. That's actually how Garrison started fly fishing, because you saw dry fly eats.
Yeah, I took my spinning rod when I was very young up to a high mountain lake, just absolute gin clear water with a bunch of cutthroats in it, and I could watch them just run away from the lure that I had. They were terrified. And there was an old guy, probably my age, who was fly fishing, and he was having a great day. So that was really my impetus to starting fly fishing. Was that looks like a lot of fun watching these fish sip something off the surface.
But that can be a great time. You throw it out there and you're kind of thinking, whereas we discussed in a river, you're watching that naturally drift down the seam in the current. But in a lake, you just throw it out there and you're just waiting, and anticipating that eat, which can be really exciting. And then the same principle applies with the nymph. You can either put it under an indicator, bobber type item. There's a lot of different products out there that are indicators. One of them can be a really big dry fly that imitates a grasshopper or something. You would just throw that out. Again, you're not waiting for it to drift into a specific current. You're just getting it out into that shelf or near the log or whatever. And you're waiting for the fish to swim by and get excited.
Yeah. And I would say usually when I'm fly fishing in a lake, I move flies more than I do in a river, because it's a static environment. So
unless the wind is there.
In terms of correct. And the wind is your friend when you're fishing lakes. So for a long time in my early fishing career, when I would come onto a lake and it was really windy, I would be just really downtrodden about it. Like, oh, I wish it wasn't so windy. And I've learned over many years that chop on the water it gives fish a lot more confidence to be feeding. It also stirs up a lot of food. So if you have a day where it's kind of choppy on the water and kind of overcast, that can be a really good day for a lake. But I was just saying, because it's a static environment, even if I'm fishing like a dry fly with a subsurface nymph under it, or a couple of nymphs under an indicator, in a lake, I would be a lot more prone to just give it a little twitch every once in a while, give it a little movement, or even just a very, very slow retrieve. Just give it a little action, a little life, draw those fish in. In a river, you're really trying to emulate just the naturally drifting food, which is hard to approximate. In a lake, sometimes it's good to give it a little life. So I do fish streamers a lot in lakes. You'll see there's a couple of images here. These are streamers that I've tied. So on the left is sort of, they're approximations of kind of different fish, right? But they have a little sparkle. They have a lot of nice natural movement in the water. And if you're fishing a lure, the same principles would would apply. And once again, I would vary that retrieve speed, right?
Faster, slower,
try some
heavier,
fast, try some slow. I mean, I've
wider.
had days on a lake where I kind of messed up my cast and I wasn't sure if it really got all the way out there, and I was really upset about it. And so I was just like bringing it in as fast as I could, like, oh, the cast is terrible. And then a fish just hammered it. And I'm like, oh,
Faster retrieve.
fast retrieve is the move today, I guess. So, you know, switch it up, see what's working. Look for those color changes, look for those depth changes, and move around. You know, try some points, try some steep drop-offs, try some shallow flats, see if you can get a pattern going. Conventional fishing in lakes is going to be very similar to what we just discussed, right? If it's under a bobber, similar to being under an indicator, you're kind of letting it ride. Once again, if you got a little chop on the water, so your bait or your nymphs is kind of going under the water, is usually a good thing. And with any technique in Stillwater, whether you're fishing a bobber, you're fishing flies, any subsurface technique in the lake, it's always a great idea to just keep adjusting your depth. Depending on the time of year, depending on the water temperatures, fish are going to usually be in some sort of relative zone in the lake of depth. So see if you can keep varying that up and take your best guess and start at 3 feet. If you're not getting anything, go to 5 feet. Well, you're seeing some fish maybe, but they're not quite rising. They're right up 2 feet. You know, just keep moving around until you can hopefully get some sort of a feel for where the majority of those fish are in the water column. And we touched on lures and spinners, very similar to fishing a streamer or any type of bait fish or prey item imitation. Vary that retrieve. Also vary maybe the level of like flash and attractor pattern. In other words, like maybe you're trying a lure that's like really got a lot of bright flash on a full metal spinner or something that's giving you a lot of kick, and a fly with a lot of flash. That can be really good. If that's not working, maybe try something that's like much more low key, a little bit more
neutral.
Yeah, a little more natural. See if that's maybe getting some action.
Awesome. Thank you, Corrine and Garrison. Appreciate all of that. And next, we're going to move into what to do if you catch a trout, which hopefully, after learning all of this stuff from Eeland, Corrine, and Garrison, will be happening. Before we jump into that, I just want to let everybody know, just a reminder, if you have your questions, please just stick them into the chat and send them to the panelists so we can keep track of them. And with that, I'll let Sascha Danylchuk take care of the fish handling.
Hi, thanks so much. Okay, so Eeland and Corrine and Garrison talked a lot about, how do you find trout? What are you looking for? What's the trout going to be looking for? Now you've hooked up, you've caught a fish, you've reeled it in, and now what do you do? Well, you have a couple choices. And if you're fishing for food, if this is going to be dinner, you want to eat your catch, that's awesome. And absolutely make sure you're checking regulations, make sure you know what you've caught, remembering some of those species that Eeland went over in the beginning. Lots of places have different regulations for different species. Sometimes there's things like size limits, so you have to have a way to measure your fish. Sometimes there'll be closed seasons, and regulations can even vary with different bodies of water. So if you're planning on keeping your fish, knowing the regulations is really important. And they actually want you to keep the fish. So knowing what the regulations are is great. If you're gonna keep fish, and the number one thing you want to do is to kill it quickly. And really that's going to give you the best quality of meat. If you kind of let that fish take a long time to die, you're not going to get as good meat. So you want to kill it quickly and get it on ice quickly. And so there's, in these photos here, there's a couple of places that work really well for killing trout, and you're essentially banging them on the head. You can use rock, you can bang them against the rock, whatever you've got that works well. But hitting them on the head is going to work quick. The fish suffers less, the meat ends up tasting better. And sometimes you can also end up breaking their spinal cord, and that works pretty well as well too. But getting those fish dispatched quickly and then putting them on ice is the other thing that's really helpful. Keeping them cool, keeping that fish spoils fairly quickly, so you want to keep them cool. Sometimes you can bleed out fish as well, and that helps preserve the meat, have nicer flavored fish. So there's a ton of videos on this on if you YouTube how to kill trout quickly, there's a lot of different information. And then there's also some really good resources. There's a Japanese method called ikichimi, which talks about how to kill fish humanely and quickly. So if you go to their website, you can even type in for different species and it'll tell you specifically where on the head that you want to bash the fish to kill it quickly. So that's killing fish. Your other choice is to let it go. And, even if you're fishing for food, because of some of those regulations that I mentioned before, you're going to end up letting some fish go. We all release fish, whether it's through voluntary practices, through catch and release, or because of regulations. So the organization that I run, Keep Fish Wet, we take a lot of the science that's been done on catch and release and turn those into best practices. What are the things that you can do as an angler that help your fish be more likely to survive and be healthy after release? And we've taken, there's over 400 studies on catch and release, and we've gone through them, and we have essentially boiled down the best practices to 3 simple, easy to remember principles. And then we have a bunch of individual tips as well that can kind of be more specific depending on the kind of fishing you're doing. So our first principle is to minimize air exposure. And 10 seconds or less total of air exposure is okay, is safe for most species. And air exposure really goes into, how fish gills work. So Eeland talked in the beginning, right? You can see on this top diagram here, we have that water coming in to the mouth. It's flowing over the gills, which you can see are those pink kind of finger-like structures, and then out through the operculum. And as Eeland mentioned before, fish get their oxygen from the water, but it's dissolved oxygen. And so taking a fish out of the water is essentially like you putting your head in the water. The fish ends up having to hold its breath. So we have a bunch of studies that show that air exposure is not so good for fish, especially after they've just been exercised on the end of your line. And it's all about to what degree air exposure is unhealthy for them. And that's where that 10-second rule comes in. So keeping air exposure less than 10 seconds is fairly easy to do in most fishing situations as well. And there's a couple tips, a couple things you can do to help minimize air exposure and to keep it under 10 seconds. So The easiest one is just to, keep your fish in the water or over the water. If you're fishing from a boat, obviously this gets a little more complicated. If you can lean over the side of the boat, that's the best thing to do. If you can get out of the boat, that's another great way to deal with handling your fish. Photographing your fish in the water is really, really helpful. I don't always love selfie sticks, but they work really, really well for getting good fish photographs. Like in the top left here, you put your GoPro or your phone or whatever it is on a selfie stick, and you can kind of lean it over the side of the boat, and then you don't have to get out of the boat. So having a fishing buddy there, somebody with you, also helps a lot for keeping fish in the water. If you're using a net and netting the fish, just remember, once the fish is in the net, you can still keep the net in the water. And then for fish that are deeply hooked, it's better to cut the line than to try to dig a hook out of, like, if it's way back kind of in the gullet. You want to just cut the line instead of trying to get that hook out. And fish have a bunch of vital organs that are back towards the back of their esophagus, including their heart. So you don't want to spend a lot of time digging deep into a fish's throat, just because there's potential to cause more damage, and fish will actually pass a hook on their own. So the second principle that is really important is to eliminate contact with dry surfaces. Eeland talked about that, fish being covered in slime, and it's really a protective coating, kind of the same way our skin is for us. It keeps out disease and infections, and fish are particularly prone to fungal infections. So you want that keep that slime coating intact as possible. And so any way you're handling a fish that has the potential to remove that slime can be detrimental. So making sure that you get your hands wet before you hold a fish. Make sure they're clean and not covered in sunscreen is really important. Rubber nets like this one in the top photo here are the most gentle on fish. There's a number of different net types out there. If you can avoid the ones that are knotted nylon, and those are much rougher surfaces, those remove a lot of slime. So this kind of rubberized net is much more gentle on fish. And then just thinking about holding your fish carefully, avoiding bringing it into a boat. Even the best anglers drop fish. They are slippery, slimy creatures. So we've all dropped fish, but if you're holding them over the water, then you just drop them back into the water as opposed to having them bang around in the bottom of your boat. And then just not bringing fish up onto the shoreline, whether that's rocks or sand, any of that will also remove some of their slime. So trying to keep them as much as possible in or over the water, and holding them carefully. And a great way to hold fish, and you can see in this photo in the bottom right there, is one hand kind of around just the base of the tail, and then the other hand kind of under their belly there, and that works really well. So our third principle is to reduce handling time. And handling time is really anything you're doing from the fish, from when you land it to when you let it go, whether it's in your hands or a net, that all counts as handling time. And essentially this restraining of the fish gets stressful for them as well. So we want to let them go, let them, recover where they need to, let them, swim, go hunt for more food, do whatever they need to do as soon as possible. So a couple ways that are really helpful for reducing handling time. One is to crush the barbs on your hooks. Most hooks, almost all hooks out there come with barbs, and you can just use a pair of pliers to pinch those barbs down. And the hook goes in easier, it comes out of the fish much easier as well. Honestly, one of the big reasons I crush the barbs on my hooks is that you will hook yourself at some point, and it is much easier to get a barbless hook out of your own skin as well, or out of your fishing buddy's skin, than it is to deal with a barbed hook. The other thing that's really helpful for reducing handling time is to carry some sort of a hook removal device. And this can be almost anything that you can use besides your fingers. So the bottom left picture here are some tools made by Waterworks Lamson called Catch and Release, and they work really well. They're specifically designed to get a hook out of a fish's mouth. But it could be even a pair of hemostats, it could be a pair of pliers, whatever works for you and you can use quickly and efficiently, is really helpful. So it doesn't have to be anything very fancy. You know, cheap pliers work as well as expensive pliers. So just having something besides your fingers, and especially if you're fly fishing and using really, really tiny little flies, like some of those nymphs that Garrison was talking about, or midges, you know, it's great to have something else, because those hooks can actually be much harder to remove from a fish's mouth. So just having something else. And there's a bunch of different, you know, specifically hook removal tools. But, you know, if you get one of those, the other thing is it's worth spending a little bit of time playing around with it. You can even like hook a fly into a piece of fabric or a banana, something like that, a piece of fruit, and just practice using it, because most of them take a little adjustment to get used to figuring out the right action. But once you've played around with it for 10 minutes or something like that, you'll become much more adept and much quicker about getting the flies out. The other couple things that's really helpful for reducing handling time is, one is to, you see people talking about reviving fish. Sometimes they move fish back and forth to try to get more oxygen over the gills. Sometimes they say move them in a figure 8. If you're fishing moving water, sometimes they'll say to hold a fish into a current. If your fish can't swim, that is a great thing to be doing. And you absolutely want to get your fish into a state where it can swim on its own. On the other hand, if your fish can swim, you probably don't need to do any of these revival techniques. It will recover on its own in its place of choosing better than it will in your hands. So if the fish can swim, go ahead and let it go. It doesn't matter if it swims off slowly or shoots right out of your hands. It'll take care of itself. And then the last part for reducing handling time is just to be ready. Have the tools that you need, whether it's pliers, hemostats, one of these hook removal tools. Have it somewhere that's easily accessible. You know, there's all sorts of fun gear to get into when it comes to fishing. You know, zingers, all sorts of things that you can have that can help you keep your tools accessible, whether you put them on your belt or a fishing vest or whatever it is that you choose. But just have the things you need accessible. And that goes for, if you're going to take a picture of your fish, make sure your camera is in a place where you can reach it as well. Because it's really then quick and easy to get a photograph, as opposed to trying to dig through all your gear. So a couple things specifically about taking photos of your fish. Again, we just talked about having the camera ready to go. Getting a lower angle, being as close to the water as possible, is really, really helpful for getting better photos of fish. And then let whoever is taking the photo call the shots. So you can keep your fish in the water, whether it's in the net or you're just holding it, keep it in the water. The photographer can be the one to say, okay, 3, 2, 1, you can lift the fish, get a couple photos, and then put it back in. The other thing that's really helpful if you're taking photographs on a phone as opposed to just with a camera is that you can actually take video the whole time, and then you can pull still images out of that video. So instead of trying to take 10 really quick shots, you can just do video, and then you have kind of a much more wide range of photos to choose from. There's a couple of devices on the market that also are really great for taking photos of fish. The camera housing on the bottom there is called an Access Go, and it fits a number of different kinds of phones, and it's got that big dome lens on the front, and that enables you to take what's usually called a split shot, like in the bottom right there. So you have the fishes underwater, but the top of that big dome lens is above the water, so you can also see the angler. So the fish never comes out of the water, and you can get some really great photos. You can still have the angler in the photo, and be keeping the fish in the water. So if you really get into fly fishing, those are a bit more of an investment, but you can even use something much more simple than an Access Go. I've even seen people take photographs underwater by putting their phone in a Ziploc bag. So if you're daring enough to try that, does take pretty good photos as well. So one other thing that you can do is to think about becoming an advocate. We have a program that's just a pledge-based program. It's totally free. It doesn't cost you anything to sign up, but it's that you pledge to use best practices for the fish that you are going to release. So if you go to our website, there's information about it. And it's one of the ways that we also continue to provide some education for anglers about fish handling.
Awesome. Thank you, Sascha. That was great. So everyone, I think we're going to move into our Q&A panel session now. We have a bunch of questions that we got lined up right now, and I believe we've been moved to Spotlight so everyone can see us. And I think I'll just I'll get rocking on these questions. If you have any that come up, folks, be sure to drop them into the chat, and we're going to try to keep track of them as best we can. And I think kind of first I'll start with just to kind of piggyback, Sascha, off of what you were just talking about. We had a question: should I gut a fish right away or just kill it? Like, what's the best to do once somebody catches a fish and that they want to keep it? Should I go ahead and gut it right then and there, or what are we looking at?
Yeah, I think that's usually helpful. Some situations don't allow you to, depending on where you're fishing, to gut it right away. If you're in a boat, maybe there's not a great place to do that. So if you kill it and keep it cold, kind of having some ice or something that you can put it on, you can wait a little longer to gut it if you can't do it immediately. But if you have that option, it's a great one.
The only other thing I would add there is if you want to fillet the fish, it's a lot easier to fillet it if you haven't gutted it. So if you can keep it pretty cold, and if you're planning on filleting it, if you can keep it quite cold and do that pretty soon, I would wait to gut it. If you're going to cook the fish whole and like stuff it, then if you have an opportunity, you could gut it immediately would be better.
Yeah, it's nice if you're going to keep it whole to gut it right away, get all that stuff out. You can kind of, especially in like a high mountain stream, get all that stuff out there. Like Sascha said, some places you're not allowed to leave a gut pile or, wash it down.
And for trout specifically, I would say if they're really small, I would recommend gutting them and cooking them whole, and then just eating the flesh off of the whole fish, because the bones are so small. If you try to fillet them, they're very hard to deal with. If you cook the fish whole and eat the flesh off, then all the bones stay intact to the spine, and it's a much more pleasurable experience. If you have a larger trout, then you can fillet it, debone it, and have a really nice fillet.
Excellent. Another question. What do I do if someone is in my spot, or the spot that I was hoping to get to when I show up to the river, or even the lake? Like what are some excuse me, some etiquette points that we can talk about?
Well, one of the things is, especially on, a river here in Colorado, sometimes you kind of come through the foliage, a tree, and all of a sudden there's somebody right there. Depending on your personality, if you're me, you're just going to back away and you're going to find somewhere else. If you're Garrison, you're going to have a conversation with that person and just kind of figure out what their plan is for the day. And
I'm always that guy that's like, hey, how's it going? Are you moving upstream? Or are you going downstream? Like, where are you planning on being? Is there a place that I can fish where I'm not going to be in your way because you were here first?
It's sort of a right of way. The first person there, they get first right.
And a lot of times, if, depending on the person, that conversation can be a really nice conversation with a fellow angler, maybe give you some tips and have a nice little on your way and some place to fish.
And then on the other hand, on lakes, a lot of times, like, the shoreline is just as good, 10 feet away. You all have casting distance, there's fish all around, and maybe you just made a new friend and you're netting each other's fish. You're using each other's Ziploc bags to take really great photos for each other. I mean, there's many a story of people that are texting each other photos with strangers, that they met that day because they just happened to be fishing near each other. So you should go with the Garrison technique of talking to someone instead of me.
I'll throw in my 2 cents there, and to that point, Corrine, I agree, and I try to at least ask any anglers that are there when I assess the situation, and just to ask them, hey, are you working upstream or downstream if it's on a river? That's just at least that one. That way I know I'm not going to go upstream and get in the way of where they were trying to work, or be downstream and what we sometimes call low hole them and kind of get in their way if they're working down. Another question came in from the audience. When my lure hits the water and it hits hard, does that attract the fish, or will that put fish off?
So the shorter answer is it depends, but the longer answer is that usually I would say the more softly you can present your lure is going to be better for trout. That high impact splash, more often than not, is going to spook fish as opposed to attract fish. It can absolutely work in the other way. And sometimes, if I'm streamer fishing, the kind of fly fishing equivalent of a lure, if the fish are really aggressive, and I just have that feeling for the day, and I've seen this happening, I'll smack the fly down on the water, and that impact will kind of create those fish, cause those fish to be like, what is that? I'm going to go look at it. I would say that's more likely to happen in high water conditions or in off color water conditions. If the water is really clear, or if the water is really calm, it's much more likely that high impact of your lure is going to spook the fish as opposed to attract the fish.
And this is about trout, but there are certain species of fish, like a bass will often be like, what was that? And then come right over and take a look at it. And so that can have an attracting you know, pattern for them. But since we're talking about trout, they're just a little bit more delicate than a lot of species.
So a little bit on Garrison, you just kind of touched quickly on something that we had a question about. Someone asked, I heard it's good to fish after the rain. Is that true? So I think kind of what you just touched on as far as like high water and things like that. And maybe you can add a little bit about where to look for the fish in high water situations.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of times if a river has been pretty low and pretty kind of stagnant in its flows, maybe been kind of doing the same thing for a long time, it's been just sort of clear, and then you get a rain event and that river comes up, what that's going to do is just flush a lot of food into the system. There's going to be a lot of little annelids and worms and terrestrial things and aquatic invertebrates that are all getting dislodged by that increase of current. And so that can be a really productive time to target fish because they really take advantage of that increase in food source. Sometimes it also will create some color to the water, right? You have some increased sediment load. If the water's a little bit off color, that's not necessarily bad. It can be even quite a bit off color. And as long as you can present a fly or a lure pretty close to the fish, if they have 1.5 feet of visibility, it can be a really good day. You know, as the water level rises in a creek, river, or stream, those fish are going to get pushed more and more to the edges, right? Because the central current corridor of that piece of water is going to become more and more inhospitable with the increased current. So as the water level rises, be very cognizant of targeting those edge areas right on the bank.
Be even more sneaky than you were going to be before.
And that's one advantage of high water and off color water. Sometimes because of that, you don't need to be as stealthy, which can be great because those fish can't see you as well. So it can definitely be a good time. Now, there are occasions where the water coming in is too much. It's too high. It's too off color. It's too cold.
Those fish just shut down.
And they kind of go into survival mode. They're kind of trying to find a place where they can like ride out the event before they're really in like an active feeding space anymore. That'd be my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I'll throw a little nugget in there too, as far as presentation, and this applies for and talking more streamer fishing for fly fishing, and also your lures or spinners. I personally subscribe to the theory of when it's muddier, more murky water, using a little bit more of a solid color, darker color lure or fly. And then as opposed to when it's clear, I feel a little bit more comfortable using some more flash and a lighter color fly or lure. And I just feel that it presents those darker colors, push out a little bit darker shadow, and it's a little bit easier for those fish to see in the more off colored water. And I want to add to
profile.
It's all about the profile. Exactly right. And to that note, that's kind of why we say, why you shared that 45-degree angle casting downstream. When you do that and you let the fly swing across, when or the spinner or whatever, it kind of turns that lure, spinner, fly broadside a little bit and allows it to go in front of that trout into that vision that that field of vision Eeland talked about, and they get more of a profile. And I'm a big subscriber to that train of thought too, showing as much of the profile of your bait, lure, whatever to the fish. And finally, kind of wrapping that up, I want to tie it back to day one, where we had a bit of a conversation about just safety and gear. So if you are going to go out and fish in those little bit higher water events, make sure you got some good waders, make sure you got your wading belt, make sure you bring your wading staff, your boots, you have boots on, make sure that they have some studs or whatever to give you the best, as much safety as possible. So we had another one come in, just asking about tips on fighting and handling a trout. once you actually get it to eat. So I think that maybe we can kind of all share in this, because Sascha, this might touch into a little bit about, you know, stress on the fish as well.
Yeah, is the question about how to fight and handle?
Yeah, I mean, basically, like any kind of tips on fighting and landing a trout, and I think really to minimize and get in as quick as possible and as efficiently too as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, you don't want to play a fish, leave it on the end of your line until it's totally exhausted. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's the fun part, right? Is fighting a fish. So, there's a little push and pull there, but you want to land the fish fairly efficiently. It depends on, the kind of gear you're using. It's one reason, I don't know if you guys talked about this last week, but, making sure that you match your tackle and your gear, to approximately the size of the fish you're going to be catching. And so, landing that fish pretty quickly is great. One thing that works really well for newer anglers is to have a net. It's much easier to land fish using a net, even if you're fishing by yourself, to be able to, scoop that fish up, than to try to grab onto it, than to try to grab the leader or tail the fish or something like that. You're more likely to lose the fish as well. So a net is a great tool to help you to land your fish pretty quickly. And yeah.
And I'll piggyback on, even prior to getting to fight the fish, the other part is, we talked so much about like put the food in front of the fish, but if a fish does eat, and we talked about some of those visual cues, or with streamers and lures, it's a sensitive cue. You feel that pull, is you have to set the hook. And that just means you are getting the hook into the fish's face, as opposed to the fish being able to spit it out. And so usually with trout, it's just a quick raise of the rod tip. You'll hear a lot about a trout set the more and more you fish. And so you just quickly raise the rod tip up, and ideally you're keeping a really tight line. So if you're fly fishing, that means that your fingers or your hands are in contact with the line that is then in contact with the fish at all times. And then you're either using the reel, or in fly fishing, you can just pull the line through your fingers during that fight. And the key is you just want to keep good contact between the fish, which is on the hook, which is then in contact with your hand or reel, so that the fish is staying tight. If it's a really big fish, you also want to let it run, because that's that part that Sascha was talking about. They do need to get a little bit tired, especially big fish, to be able to get them into the net or land them. And I will say, I am not a beginner angler, and I still always prefer a net. It's easier to be able to land a fish, and it's obviously, as Sascha described for us, it's better for the fish as well. If you want a photo, you can keep it in there nice and safely. So all of those things.
And from the perspective of like just landing the fish that you have hooked and you want to see it, it's better if you have the tackle and the matched appropriately to land that fish as fast as possible.
Yeah.
The farther that fish gets away from you, if you just like let them run, the more things that can go wrong. So
they'll find a log, maybe.
Right. So not just for the fish's health, but for you as an angler to successfully land fish.
For your ego.
Correct. Depending on your tackle, and you'll figure out what that breaking point is, literally and figuratively. But the faster you can put that fish in the net, the better.
Great advice. I think we have one more that came in, just asking for our opinion. What best time of day do we prefer to fish for trout? We can all kind of give our opinions, and I'll give my personal opinion. I personally like evenings, and especially for a good hatch here in Pennsylvania, that's my favorite. However, sometimes I do like to get out early, just because I know that there's usually going to be less people on the river. So that's That's my 2 cents.
I usually
I
like early too. Yeah.
Go ahead, Sascha.
Okay. I like evenings, but I'm not always a morning person, so that's where that comes in. But
For me, I like the morning, I like the evening. For me, it's a lot about the time of year. Like if we're fishing in Colorado here in the winter, a lot of times the best time to fish is the warmest time of the day because the water temperatures in the river are so cold
That can be like 3 o'clock.
yeah, that the fish are not really active until you have some warmer temperatures. So then I'm like, okay, I don't want to really get to the river and start fishing until like 10 because I want the temperatures to be up. If the water temperatures have been really warm here in Colorado and it's like August, then I want to be off the water by like 1 because those water temperatures are going to be climbing in the afternoon and into the evening.
And that's not just for the angler's pleasure, that's for the fish's health, because primarily we're catching and releasing. And so we want to give those fish a higher rate of
and we
survival.
saw that little thermometer graphic that Eeland had, right? So if you have a situation where by like 2 o'clock, you're going to be in the 67-degree temperature range, it's time to head for a cold one, right? So it kind of depends for me on the time of year, but it's hard to beat the late evening.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I think another thing though, Eeland mentioned mousing for trout. It just kind of shows you that you can actually kind of, weather permitting, you can fish for trout all times of the day. You just got to figure out the right way to actually do it.
I also like Sasha's point of like, if you're not a morning person, like this is also for fun. Like the reason to do this is because it's fun. So if you don't like getting up early, like you should be the evening. Get that like after dinner, or maybe bring your dinner, have a little picnic. Just make it a fun event. That's the whole point.
I agree. One more. This one's revolving around clothing. And I think we can kind of talk about approach. So do we feel that bright color clothing is not good as opposed to trying to be as camouflage as possible? Not necessarily that you have to wear camouflage when you're fishing, but what are our thoughts on our clothing and approaching fish and part of our presentation?
Well, I'm the guy wearing a camo hat, so I guess I'll field that one out of the gate. I think that bright colored clothing when fishing for trout is maybe not as good. I would go with like some duller colors as like a blanket statement. That being said, I think that you can be very successful fishing for trout almost any day wearing a bright red hat. I think it's more about how you position your body, the angle of your cast, the distance, and I think you can approach a fish or where you think a fish is going to be, even if you can't cast very far, very stealthily and stay very low and move very slow and get quite close to that fish, even if you are in a bright red jumper and still catch it. That being said, across the board, it's probably better to wear dull colors. Trout are very visual. I wouldn't get too caught up with it out of the gate, I guess would be my 2 cents.
Good point. Okay, well, that's it for today. So I just want to thank everybody. And please be sure to join us next week, Friday the 28th. So again, 7 p.m. Eastern for PA, and that says 7 p.m. Eastern for Colorado, but it's 7 p.m. Mountain Time for Colorado. So 7 p.m. no matter where you are. We'll send those links out later this week or later next week. And if you want to connect with any of our presenters here, Eeland had to leave, but he wanted me to thank everybody for him. His Instagram is on there. Black Steve Irwin, Garrison, and Corrine are at Wrap Your Water, and Sascha is at Keep Fish Wet. But again, thank you to our presenters so much. Thank you all for being here. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck out there on the water.
Yeah, have fun.
Yeah.